Chapter 7. The Sufism of the 7th century and the School of Ibn Arabi. In certain late phases of the life cycle of a religious tradition, there often occurs a kind of return to the original golden age, when spiritual vitality was most intense and the tradition was closest to its celestial source. Such a phase can be identified, in Islamic history, with the 7th century of the Hijra, 13th century of the Christian era, during which there appeared an extraordinarily intense spiritual life that seems like a testimony to the prophetic age itself. It is enough to consider the peaks of Sufism reached at that time by Ibn Arabi, Sadr al-Din al-Kanawi, Jalal al-Din Rumi, Najm al-Din Kubra, and the entire Central Asian school, to understand the exceptional nature of this remarkable chapter in the history of Islam and particularly of Sufism. Among the most characteristic events of this period is the foundation of the school of Ibn Arabi, which gave a new tone to a considerable part of doctrinal Sufism by bringing together numerous spiritual currents that later served as the basis for further developments. The spread of Ibn Arabi's teachings in the eastern regions of Islam, a subject we shall address in this chapter, is undoubtedly one of the most important spiritual and intellectual events of that era. In the eastern lands of Islam, Ibn Arabi's teachings found the most favorable ground to flourish. There his doctrines not only transformed the language of doctrinal Sufism, but also penetrated theology and theosophy or traditional philosophy, hikmah. For 7 centuries, generations of scholars and saints have commented on his works, and to this day his masterwork, Fusus al-Hikam, the Bezels of Wisdom, continues to be studied in traditional religious circles and explained in gatherings of Sufis and Gnostics. The spread of Ibn Arabi's teachings in these eastern regions, especially in Persia, can best be studied by distinguishing several categories among those who received his influence. First, there are the great Sufis properly speaking, many of whom were also masters of the Persian language. In their teachings one finds, under various forms, elements derived from the doctrines of Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. The greatest Persian language poet, Jalal al-Din Rumi, whose influence also extended to the Turkish world and the Indo-Pakistani subcontinent, is linked to Ibn Arabi through his close friend Sadr al-Din al-Kanawi, a disciple of the latter. Some have called the Masnavi the Fusus in Persian verse. In certain respects there is indeed a close relationship between these two giants of Islamic gnosis. However, Rumi also represents another form and another aspect of Sufism, complementary to that of Ibn Arabi and not simply derived from it. After Rumi, other famous Sufi writers such as Aziz Nasafi and Sa'd al-Din Jamuyah, although belonging to the Central Asian school of Najm al-Din Kubra, likewise show the extent to which they were indebted to the doctrinal expositions of the Sheikh al-Akbar, the greatest master. Even Ala al-Dawla Simnani, who criticized some of Ibn Arabi's formulations, was clearly influenced by him. Likewise, among the eminent poets of this period, some, such as Hafez and Sadi, continued to express themselves through the classical imagery of Sana'a, Attar, and Rumi, occasionally enriching it with new dimensions, but always within the same symbolic framework. Others, however, drew directly on Ibn Arabi's teachings and presented them in exquisite Persian poetry or prose. The Lamat, the Flashes, of Fakhr al-Din Iraqi, a disciple of Sadr al-Din al-Kanawi, especially through the commentary of Jami entitled The Rays of the Flashes, is a perfect example of this. The same can be said of the poems of Avhad al-Din Kermani and Gulshan-i-Raz, The Rose Garden of Secrets, by Mahmud Shabastari. This last work contains a synthesis of the entire Sufi doctrine according to the exposition of Muhyi al-Din. Its verses, of celestial beauty, have become part of the common heritage of all Persian-speaking peoples and are equally well known in Pakistan and among the Muslims of India. Likewise, the most famous commentator on the Gulshan-i-Raz, Sheikh Muhammad Lahi, founder of the Nurbakhshi Sufi order, was deeply influenced by the Sheikh al-Akbar, the name by which Ibn Arabi is known in the East. Another great master of Persian Sufism, Shah Ni'matullah Wali, founder of the Ni'matullahi order, currently the most widespread in Persia, with branches in Pakistan and other Muslim countries, translated the Fusus into Persian and also produced a commented poetic version. He himself openly declares his spiritual affiliation to Ibn Arabi in these verses. The words of the Fusus were deposited in our heart like a jewel in its setting. They came to it from the Prophet of God, and from the spirit of Ibn Arabi they were set within us. No further explanation is needed to show the deep bond that exists between Ibn Arabi and one of the greatest masters of later Persian Sufism. The great poet Abd al-Rahman Jami, who did so much to spread the teachings of Ibn Arabi, belongs to this same category of Sufi poets and masters. He exerted an immense influence over his contemporaries and later generations through his commentaries on the works of the Sheikh al-Akbar, the composition of original works based on his doctrinal teachings, and the creation of autonomous works in both verse and prose. His example was followed by numerous later poets, including Safayi Isfahani, a prominent 19th-century Sufi poet deeply versed in the fusus and in the writings of Sadr al-Din al-Kanawi, who also composed some of the most beautiful Sufi poetry of his time. Shura'i theologians also received the influence of Ibn Arabi. By incorporating his teachings into the doctrinal structure of Twelver Shurism, they prepared the ground for the great intellectual synthesis of the Safavid era, when Persia became almost entirely Shura'i. The relationship between the doctrines of Ibn Arabi and Shura'i Gnosis, within which they were so rapidly integrated, deserves a deep and detailed study. Soon after the spread of his teachings, Ibn Arabi found followers among Shura'i theologians and Gnostics, such as Sayyid Haidar Amuli, who also wrote a commentary on the Fusus, Ibn Turka, whose introduction to the fundamental principles constitutes an introduction to the Fusus and who also wrote an important commentary on this work, and Ibn Abi Jumhur, who reflects many of the doctrines of the Sheikh al-Akbar in his Book of Elucidation. It should also be recalled that Ibn Arabi's influence extended to Ismaili authors, many of whom wrote in Persian, although India would later become their second homeland. Even today, the most widely read and circulated Quranic commentary among the Ismailis is attributed to Ibn Arabi, who, in a rather singular way, is considered by many of them to be one of their own. The entire group of Ismaili authors who wrote in Persian during the 7th and 8th centuries of the Hijra, 13th and 14th centuries of the Christian era, until the moment when Ismailism in Persia became a secret movement, constitutes a remarkable and interesting continuation of Ibn Arabi's teachings. Within the Islamic world. With the advent of the Safavids, a revival of Islamic philosophy took place in Persia, culminating in Sadr al-Din Shirazi, better known as Mullah Sadra. By fusing the principles of peripatetic philosophy with those of illuminationist doctrine, Ishraq, and the Gnosis, Irfan, of Ibn Arabi, this great thinker was able to create a new intellectual horizon and found a school that still survives in Persia today. Mullah Sadra had deeply assimilated the teachings of Ibn Arabi. His main work, Al-Asfar, The Journeys, is full of quotations from the Fusus and reflects, especially in its doctrines concerning the faculties of the soul and eschatology, the teachings of the Sheikh al-Akbar. It is no exaggeration to say that most traditional centers of Persian learning in recent centuries, especially the official religious schools, have come into contact with Ibn Arabi's doctrines primarily through the works of Mullah Sadra and his disciples, among whom are Mullah Naima Talakani, Mullah Ali Nuri, Haji Mullah Hadi Sabzavari, Mullah Ali Zanusi, and Akka Muhammad Rida Kamshai. The role played by Ibn Arabi in the formation of the important school of Hikmah is another of the most significant aspects of his influence in the eastern regions of the Islamic world. Finally, it is necessary to mention Ibn Arabi's commentators and interpreters, direct heirs and continuators of his teaching. Among them, the most representative figure, both for the eastern regions of Islam in general and for Persia in particular, is Sadr al-Din al-Kanawi, disciple and stepson of Ibn Arabi, born in Konya, through whom the master's teachings reached those lands. A great Sufi master in his own right, al-Kanawi commented on the works of the Sheikh al-Akbar and also wrote original works such as Nusus, the texts, Fukuk, the keys, and The Key to the Unseen, a work considered in Persia, together with his commentary on The Lamp of Intimacy, by Hamza Fanari, as one of the most elevated texts of Sufi metaphysics. His commentary on the Fusus is, in Persia, one of the most highly regarded, along with those of Abd al-Razak Kashani and Dawood Kaysari. Although numerous commentaries on the Fusus were written in Arabic, Persian, and even Turkish, such as those of Ali Hamadani, Ala al-Dawla Simnani, and the famous commentary of Jami, particularly important from the standpoint of the Persian language, these are often considered inferior to the three mentioned above or, in many cases, directly derived from them. Kashani and Kaysari are, after al-Kanawi, the most important disseminators of Ibn Arabi's doctrines in the East. Kaysari, with his famous commentary beginning with an independent introductory essay containing a complete cycle of Sufi metaphysics, and Kashani, with his commentary on Kanawi as well as his exegesis of the Quran and many other well-known texts. As for other famous Sufi commentaries, such as those of Bali Effendi and Nabulusi, as well as the various works of Jarumi illustrating Ibn Arabi's teachings. Although they became well known in the Arab world, they are known only to a few in the East and never achieved in Persia, Pakistan, and India the same fame and popularity as those mentioned above. The tradition of teaching and commentary on the Fusus and other works of Ibn Arabi was preserved throughout the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal periods, and even continues to the present day, although its history has not yet been fully clarified. In Persia, masters such as Mullah Hassan Lanbani, Mir Sayyid Hassan Talakani, Mullah Muhammad Jafar Abadi, Sayyid Rida Mazandarani, and Mirza Hashim Rashdi, some of whose disciples are still living, emerged, spanning the period from the 11th and 12th centuries of the Hijra, 17th and 18th centuries of the Christian era, up to the present day. There are also many Arab, Turkish, and Indo-Pakistani commentators, but the works of many of them have not yet been studied in depth. Commentaries have also appeared in China, Malaysia, and Indonesia, following the line of the better-known writings in the Arab and Persian worlds. Chapter 8. Islam and the Encounter Between Religions. We sent down the Torah, which contains guidance and light, so that the prophets who were wholly devoted to God, the rabbis, and the scholars, might judge according to it for those who follow Judaism, as trustees and witnesses of the Scripture of God. Do not fear men, but fear me, and do not sell my signs for a paltry price, for those who do not judge according to what God has sent down are unbelievers. Quran 5:44. The difference between creatures lies in the outward form, nam. Whoever penetrates the inner meaning, mana, finds peace in it. O essence of existence! Because of opinions, differences arose among Muslims, Zoroastrians, and Jews. Rumi. Sufism seeks the inner meaning, mana, through penetration of the outward form, nam. It is therefore, by its very nature, especially capable of exploring the mysterious unity that lies beyond the diversity of religious manifestations. Moreover, it is the only form of Islam capable of fully responding to the deepest questions raised by the comparative study of religions, questions that cannot be ignored without violating the very nature of religion. The spread of modern influences within the Islamic world has made the serious study of comparative religion an unavoidable necessity. To meet this need, it is essential to use all the keys preserved in Sufi wisdom, through which doors otherwise closed can be opened, thereby helping to resolve numerous intellectual problems by drawing on the knowledge transmitted by the esotericism of Islam, of which Sufism is the bearer. From the Islamic point of view regarding the question of comparison between religions, it is necessary to recall from the outset that the metaphysical and theological meaning of the presence of other religions changes depending on whether one considers traditional, homogeneous civilizations or the modern world, in which a similarly homogeneous worldview no longer exists. For the traditional man, whether Muslim or belonging to another faith, that is, for the man whose life and thought are shaped by a set of principles of transcendent origin and who lives in a society in which these principles are manifested in all domains, other religious traditions appear as foreign worlds that do not concern him in his immediate spiritual reality, except in exceptional cases that do no more than confirm the rule. Before the modern era, the founder of each religion appeared as a sun at the center of his own system, within which his followers were born, lived, and died. The founders of other religions were unknown, just as, when the sun shines, the stars cannot be seen, even though they are suns within their own systems, or else, in certain cases such as Islam, they were relegated to the rank of stars in the firmament, stars that do not possess the same importance as the sun, even though they also fulfill that function at the center of their respective solar systems. Just as man is constituted intellectually and psychically in such a way that he lives in a physical world that has a single sun, even though modern astronomy assures him that others exist, likewise he is constituted religiously and spiritually to live under the light of that particular sun which is the founder of the religion to which he belongs at in normal times. A man's religion is the religion, and indeed each religion addresses a humanity which, for it, is humanity. The exclusivity of each particular religion is a symbol of its divine origin, of the fact that it proceeds from the absolute and that it represents in itself a complete form of life. In normal circumstances there would be no need to know the metaphysical meaning of other traditions, just as man normally needs to know no more than the sun of his own solar system in order to live a normal life on Earth. Although modern astronomy teaches him that there are myriad other suns in the universe, he relegates this information to the background of his mind and continues to live as if his sun were the only one. The immediate experience of the physical world in which he lives offers him a representation that has something of the absolute precisely by virtue of its symbolic content. Man has been created to live in a world whose sky displays a single sun. Therefore, the appearance of that single sun in the firmament corresponds to the natural structure inscribed in the human mind and psyche and constitutes the natural, meaningful environment of man. In the same way, in the religious domain, man has been created to live within a homogeneous tradition whose values are for him absolute and binding values. As long as the traditional divisions of humanity subsisted, it was not necessary, or one might say it was superfluous, to attempt to penetrate the meaning of other traditions, except on particular occasions such as when two religious traditions came into contact. But even then the meaning of such encounters was not the same as today, because at present, in the West, the homogeneity of the traditional climate has been broken, and to varying degrees it has also been affected in those parts of the world where the modernist conception has taken root. For centuries upon centuries, Christian and Jewish minorities lived in the Islamic world, and at times religious contacts took place between different communities. However, each of them continued to live within its own traditional world. In such a situation, for one tradition, the study of another was not considered necessary in the same way as it is for a person who has received a non-traditional education and who, having been in contact with the fruits of modern thought, is compelled to confront the problem of other religions on a completely different basis, considering his own nature. It could therefore be said that the need to study other religious traditions has arisen from the particular situation of the modern world, in which both the boundaries of the religious universe and those of the astronomical universe have been dismantled. The dilemma of remaining faithful to one's own religion or accepting the validity of other traditions is one of the many consequences of the abnormal situation that modern man must face and of the anomalous condition in which he finds himself. And yet it is a situation that must be faced, under penalty of losing religious faith. For a traditional Muslim living in Fez or Mashhad, it is not necessary to concern oneself with the truths of Buddhism or Christianity. Nor is it urgent for an Italian or Spanish peasant to learn about Hinduism. But one who has seen the homogeneity of religious culture broken by modern and secular philosophies, or who has been influenced by contact with the authentic spirituality of foreign traditions, can no longer ignore the metaphysical and theological contents present in other religions. Otherwise he would risk losing his own religion or conceiving divinity in a way that would limit, at least to some extent, divine mercy. It is precisely the plurality of religious manifestations that has been used by some as an argument against the validity of religions. The insistence on this fact, today presented in very diverse forms, demonstrates in itself the present urgency of studying other faiths precisely in order to defend religion. Moreover, this task concerns all those who have come into contact with the modern mentality and who nevertheless still feel the need for spirituality, as well as those who, thanks to exceptional circumstances, are in a position to carry out this task. Traditional authorities have every right to address a traditional audience without needing to refer to other religious forms. But there are also those who have the vocation of providing the keys to access the sapiential heritage of other traditions, revealing to all those destined to receive this wisdom the essential unity and essential universality, while at the same time bringing to light the formal differences between tradition and revelation. Faced with contemporary skepticism, the most valid argument in defense of religion is precisely its universality, the awareness of the fundamental truth that God has addressed man many times, saying on each occasion, I, and speaking a language appropriate to that specific portion of humanity to which that revelation was directed. Evidently, the study of the relationship between religions constitutes a serious problem only for those who seek the very truth of religion. For the skeptic, for the scientific observer, for the syncretist, the problem does not go beyond the more general field of historical events and phenomena or sentimental attitudes. This approach to the question does not concern us here. The essential problem posed by the study of religion consists in how to maintain religious truth, traditional orthodoxy, and the dogmatic theological structures of one's own religion, while at the same time attaining knowledge of other traditions and accepting them as spiritually valid means and paths to God. For one who cannot distinguish colors, it is of little importance to know which ones form the rainbow. It is precisely this requirement of truth in studying other religions in their theological and metaphysical aspect that constitutes, at the same time, the source of so many difficulties. Modernism has suppressed or at least impoverished religious faith. Men of the past were not only less skeptical than modern men, but also possessed a less narrow faith than the latter. Today everyone takes pleasure in having an open mind, it may be admitted that it is good to keep the windows of the mind open, provided that the mind also has walls. If a room has no walls, it becomes irrelevant whether its windows are open or closed. When man rejects revelation and tradition, his openness of mind, from a religious point of view, has little value, since he has lost the criterion that allows him to distinguish truth from falsehood. Faith has become narrower in many Christians, as well as in many Muslims, in many Hindus, and so on. We are not referring here to those who have placed themselves outside tradition and therefore no longer possess any faith, but to those who still remain within it, although their faith has been considerably impoverished under the assault of modernism. To cite only the case of Islam, modernism has not only weakened the faith of certain individuals, but has also given rise to movements opposed to the most universal form of Islam, namely Sufism. It often happens that a simple peasant possesses a more universal conception of Islam than a rationalist trained at the university. Another difficulty that modernism poses to a profound study of other religions lies precisely in its denial of the metaphysical principles that constitute the foundation of all of them. The science of comparative religions, Religionswissenschaft, was born in the full rationalist period and became an autonomous discipline during the 19th century. The history of this discipline carries with it the limitations and prejudices characteristic of the period in which it arose. The Age of Enlightenment considered itself the supreme perfection of civilization and studied other religions as preludes to Christianity, with which it, in some sense, identified itself, despite its rebellion against Christian tradition. This attitude still persists to a certain extent. This is why Islam continues to be studied in the least adequate manner by many of those interested in comparative religions. Since Islam appeared after Christianity, it cannot be made to fit the prejudice according to which other religions are modest and childish prefigurations of something that supposedly reached its culmination in Christianity through a necessary and universally valid evolutionary process. The Enlightenment mentality of the 19th century contaminated the comparative study of religions with the theory of linear historical progress and similar conceptions, thereby providing the clearest proof of a misunderstanding of religious tradition and its spiritual meaning. Phenomenology, by criticizing the shortcomings of the historical method and privileging the morphological study of religious manifestations, represented a certain progress. However, this progress was insufficient, because what was lacking was a true metaphysics, the only one capable of revealing the transparency of forms and bringing to light their authentic inner meaning. In the West, the study of religions began precisely at the moment when, on the one hand, the authentic metaphysical aspect of the Christian tradition was becoming obscured and almost disappeared, and on the other, secular philosophies began to impose themselves, philosophies which from their very origins opposed the concept of transcendence and the scientia sacra inherent in every religion. Consequently, the study of religions has been marked by the mentality of modern Western man and has been approached according to categories taken from late developments of Christianity or from reactions against it. In any case, the indispensable metaphysical background for a profound study of religion has generally been lacking. It is therefore not without interest, precisely for the discipline of comparative religion, to examine how this problem of the encounter between religions is considered from the point of view of other traditions. Such knowledge provides an additional vision of reality, a vision that nevertheless stands within an unusual perspective and thus reveals another aspect of reality. Everything that an orthodox religion can tell us about the relationship between the various religions constitutes in itself a precious knowledge of the true nature of religion in the broader sense and helps to explain the juxtaposition of religions within the spiritual order in which they are situated. It is precisely for this purpose that the study of the question of the encounter between religions can be fruitful from the Islamic point of view, since in this way it will also be possible to highlight, for Islam itself, the metaphysical and theological implications of the presence of other religious traditions. The metaphysical foundation, which was lacking in the West when comparative religion began, has always been present in the Islamic tradition, as well as in other still living Eastern traditions. According to metaphysics, reality is not exhausted on the simple psychophysical plane in which ordinary men live, but is articulated in multiple states of being, hierarchically arranged one above the other. Each state of being possesses its own objective reality, and its degree depends on the intensity of the light of the total being that illuminates it. At the origin lies the source of all reality, the absolute, at once being and beyond being, al-dat of Sufism. The foundation of every metaphysical doctrine is the distinction between the absolute and the relative, while the task of every traditional cosmology is to unfold the science of forms relative to each particular state of being. In Islam, all metaphysics is contained in the first Shahada. La ilaha illa Allah, there is no God but God, which ultimately affirms that only the Absolute is absolute, and that everything other than it is relative, while all cosmology is contained in the second Shahida, Mohammedan Rasul Allah, Muhammad is the messenger of God, meaning that everything true in the universe, of which Muhammad is the supreme symbol, comes from God. Therefore, if the origin of all things, all beings, and all forms is transcendent reality, every being must possess an outer aspect and an inner aspect, one that manifests externally and another that is inwardly connected to the spiritual world. The Quran states that God is both the outward, al-zahir, that is, exoteric, and the inward, al-batin, that is, esoteric. One might also say, using Sufi terminology, that everything in the universe is endowed with an outward form, surah, and an inner essence, mana. The form belongs to the world of multiplicity, while the essence leads to unity, which is the source of all things. This is particularly true with respect to religion, which is the direct manifestation of the divine within the human order. It also possesses form and essence. Therefore, religions may be studied either in their forms, which can thus be described and compared, or in their essence, which leads to their inner unity, since the origin of all realities, and therefore of all religions, is God, the One. But since essence precedes form and connects it to the higher levels of being, it is only through essence that the meaning of form can be understood. Only after attaining the vision of unity can man realize the unity of all that exists. Only by understanding the essence of religion can its external manifestations be understood as intelligible symbols and not as mere opaque facts. The relations of Islam with other religions have been inspired by this metaphysical doctrine, which underlies its entire conceptual structure. Islam has studied the form of other religions and, in certain cases, also their essence. Therefore it possesses today the necessary intellectual and spiritual means to undertake this study in the new circumstances that the modern world has placed before it. A particularly relevant characteristic of Islam in this regard is the synthetic and integrating power of the Islamic revelation, which allows the grace of the prophets and saints of earlier religions, especially those of the Abrahamic tradition, to reach Muslims within the framework provided by the grace of the Prophet of Islam. For a Christian, all divine grace is centered in the person of Christ, without whom there would be no other channel of grace for men. For the Muslim, in the firmament of Islam the Prophet is like the full moon, but the other great prophets and saints are also like shining stars, though this is possible only by virtue of the grace of Muhammad, peace be upon him. A Muslim may invoke Abraham or Christ, not as Jewish or Christian prophets, but as if they were Muslims. This occurs, for example, in the popular prayer of Abraham, in the Sunni world, and in the prayer of the heir, in Shiite Islam. The synthetic power of Islam has made possible the integration of earlier spiritual poles within the Islamic world, which has thereby been enriched by their concrete spiritual influence. This characteristic of Islam, so important in its ritual life, also decisively influences its way of studying the intellectual and spiritual aspects of the problem of comparative religions. At first sight it may seem strange that, despite the characteristics described above, Islam is today, among all major religions, the one that has shown the least interest in the study of the history and doctrines of other religions, even though its point of view on the religious problem is unusually open. In this field, very few texts have been written in Persian, and even fewer in Arabic, apart from translations of European sources. Moreover, it is observed that in courses of religious studies recently established in America and England, Muslim students participating in them are less numerous than those belonging to other major traditions. The reason for this relative lack of interest among Muslims in the discipline of comparative religion is that Islam is not in any way disturbed, from a theological point of view, by the presence of other religions. The existence of other traditions is already presupposed by it. Indeed, Islam is based on the concept of the universality of revelation. The Quran, among all sacred scriptures, is the one that speaks the most universal language, and Muslims believe in the existence of a vast number of prophets, traditionally counted as 124,000, sent to all peoples. The spiritual anthropology outlined by the Quran makes prophecy a necessary element of the human condition. Man is truly man only by virtue of his participation in a tradition. Adam, the first man, was also the first prophet. Man did not evolve from polytheism to monotheism, rather, he was originally monotheistic, and therefore must be constantly reminded of the primordial truth through prophetic revelation. Man has not evolved from polytheism to monotheism. In the beginning he was monotheistic, and therefore he must be continually reminded of the original message of unity, al-Tawhid, which he is always in danger of forgetting. Human history is formed by prophetic cycles, each of which inaugurates a new cycle of humanity. Islam considers itself the reaffirmation of the original religion, of the doctrine of unity that has always existed and will always exist. For this reason it defines itself as the primordial religion, al-Din al-Hanif, arising at the end of a human cycle in order to reaffirm the essential truth of the primordial tradition. In this respect it resembles the Sanatana Dharma of Hinduism and, on the metaphysical level, it possesses a profound affinity with that tradition, which some Sufis have indeed called the religion of Adam. During the Mughal period, some of the most prominent Muslim scholars of the Indian subcontinent referred to the Hindus as al-Kitab, that is, people of the book. They were thus regarded as belonging to the chain of prophets that preceded Islam and that began with Adam. Moreover, some Indian Muslim commentators identified the prophet Dhu al-Kifl, mentioned in the Quran, with the Buddha of Kapilavastu, and they identified the fig tree of Surah 95 with the Bodhi tree under which the Buddha attained enlightenment. Muslims have always held the conviction that they possess, in its most pure form, the doctrine proclaimed by all previous religions. In Islamic Gnosis, or Sufism, this truth is al-Tawhid in the metaphysical sense, the eternal wisdom, the religio perennis which Islam has come to reveal in its fullness. For the Shiite Muslim, his monotheistic faith is the same as that revealed by all prophets. Hence, at the end of the cycle, the appearance of the Mahdi brings to light the inner meaning common to all religions. These and other, even more contingent factors have led Muslims to show less interest in the study of other religions than Christians, Hindus, and others. However, today it is necessary to remind modernly educated Muslims of the universality of their tradition, as well as of the historical relations that Islam has maintained with other religions, a fact that in recent times has been gradually forgotten in many circles. It is also necessary to apply the universal principles contained in Islam to the study of other religions, taking into account the anomalous situation created by the modern world. In order to understand how Islam can encounter other religions, it must be borne in mind that it is founded upon an exoteric dimension and an esoteric dimension, that is, upon a divine law, the Sharia, and upon a spiritual path, the Tariqah. In addition, Islam has cultivated various sciences, arts, and intellectual perspectives. It possesses its own schools of theology, philosophy, and theosophy, hikmah, understood in its original sense, before modern terminology had altered the meaning of the term. Islam also has its own historians and scholars, geographers, and travelers. Through these means, Islam has approached other religions, and in each case the depth of that encounter has depended on the degree of fidelity to these dimensions and perspectives. If we exclude the modern period, with its rapid means of communication, it can safely be said that Islam has had more contact with other traditions than any other religion in the world. It encountered Christianity and Judaism in its very place of origin and during its early expansion toward the north. It encountered the Iranian religions, Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism, in the Sasanian Empire. It gradually absorbed small communities in which remnants of ancient Hellenistic cults survived, especially the community of the Sabians of Harran, who considered themselves heirs to the most esoteric aspect of the Greek tradition. It came into contact with Buddhism in northwestern Persia, in Afghanistan, and in Central Asia, with Hinduism in Sind and, in later periods, in many regions of the Indian subcontinent. It also had contact with Mongol and Siberian shamanism at the popular level, especially through Turkic tribes that had practiced shamanism before converting to Islam. In addition, the Muslims of Xinjiang were in direct contact with the Chinese tradition. In reality, among all the major Asian religious traditions, with the exception of Shinto, which is limited to Japan, there is none with which Muslims did not maintain, from the earliest times, some form of contact, except for the Chinese tradition, with which intellectual and religious contact for most of the Islamic world only took place after the Mongol invasion. However, the Chinese Muslim community remained, to a greater or lesser extent, separated from its Western co-religionists, and therefore generally did not transmit its knowledge of the Chinese tradition. Only occasionally did a traveler such as Ibn Battuta provide some information about China to the Muslim intellectual world. The prophetic hadith, "Seek knowledge even in China," was known to all, and it was understood that China possessed an ancient sapiential tradition, and some Persian Sufis explicitly referred to the divine origin of the Chinese tradition. Farid al-Din Adar, in his Mantiq al-Tair, the conference of the birds, speaking of the simurgh, symbol of the divine essence, and of its feather, symbol of divine revelation, writes. What a wondrous thing! The first manifestation of the simurgh took place in China at midnight. One of its feathers fell upon China and its fame filled the world. Each one painted that feather and built upon it his own system of ideas, thus they fell into confusion. That feather is still found in the painting gallery of that country, and from here comes the saying, "Seek knowledge even in China." But the manifestation of this mysterious being would not have caused such commotion in the world. That sign of its existence is proof of its glory. All souls receive the imprint of the image of its feather. But since the description of this has neither head nor tail, neither beginning nor end, it is useless to add anything further on this matter. As for contacts between Islam and the Judeo-Christian tradition, these extended over nearly 14 centuries of Islamic history. Judaism and Christianity are, in a certain sense, contained within Islam, since Islam constitutes the final affirmation of the Abrahamic tradition, of which Judaism and Christianity are earlier manifestations. However, this is not a question of historical borrowing, as some Orientalists have attempted to demonstrate. The Sharia is a divine law which in many respects resembles the Talmudic law, but it is neither derived from it nor based upon it. Christ plays an immensely important role in Islam, but this does not represent a distortion of the Christian concept of Christ. Christ is, independently of Christianity, an element of Islamic religious conception. Christ and Moses, as well as the other ancient Hebrew prophets, possess their own function within Islam, independently of any possible historical influence of Judaism or Christianity. The analogies that exist derive solely from a transcendent archetype common to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, although in the early centuries of Islam contacts with Judaism and Christianity were often highly polemical on the theological level. The arguments that Philo of Alexandria and the early Church Fathers directed against the rational demonstration of doctrines such as the immortality of the soul, the resurrection of the body, and creation ex nihilo influenced early Muslim theologians, who adopted similar arguments in defense of Islam against rationalist critique. In general, most early Muslim texts on the history of religions, al-Milo wa al-Nihal, religious communities and sects, include chapters devoted to Judaism and Christianity, some of which, such as al-Mughni, the Sufficient, by Qadi Abd al-Jabbar, constitute valuable testimonies for our knowledge of certain aspects of the Eastern Church and early Christian communities. The figures of Moses and Christ are evoked in nearly all Muslim religious works, especially Sufi ones, for example in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan Revelations, of Ibn Arabi, in Rumi's Masnavi, or in Jami's Gulshan-i-Raz, the Garden of Mystery. Almost all the experiences of these prophets, such as Moses' vision of the burning bush or Christ's miracle of raising the dead, are of central importance for Sufi doctrine. It goes without saying that all these sources reject the Christian doctrines of divine sonship and incarnation, since none of them is acceptable from the Islamic point of view. In certain cases, works were even written explicitly to refute such doctrines. It should not be thought that contact between Muslims and Christian and Jewish communities was uninterrupted. In the early centuries of Islam, especially during the Abbasid period, debates between different communities were frequent. The Crusades marked the rupture of all relations and the complete isolation between Muslim and Christian communities in the Middle East, precisely where their physical proximity was greatest. At present, relations with Judaism have deteriorated as a result of the Palestinian question. In this century, the great Algerian Sufi Sheikh Ahmad al-Alawi echoed this same conception, exhorting concord among all religions in order to combat modern unbelief. He also showed a particular interest in Christianity, whose doctrines he knew in depth. In any case, contacts, both official and private, between Islam and the Judeo-Christian tradition have been very intense throughout history. This constitutes a valuable basis for an effective encounter between both religions in the contemporary world. Islam encountered the Iranian religions when it subdued the Sasanian Empire and entered the Iranian plateau. During the 3 or 4 centuries in which Islam fully consolidated its rule in Persia, it had numerous contacts with these religions, particularly with Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism. It even came to influence some of the later Zoroastrian works that appeared in the early Islamic period, while, on the other hand, certain Zoroastrian elements were integrated into specific dimensions of Islamic intellectual life. Debates with followers of Iranian religions in Basra and in Baghdad itself are attested in early theological and historical sources. From the beginning, Zoroastrians were accepted as people of the book, whereas Manichaeism was rejected on fundamental theological grounds. However, the influence of the latter, especially in cosmological and cosmogonic conceptions, can be observed in some Ismaili cosmologies, and even more in certain writings of Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi. Manichaean beliefs were also described by numerous Muslim scholars, such as Ibn al-Nadim and al-Biruni, so that Muslim texts constitute a precious source for our knowledge of certain aspects of Manichaeism. Zoroastrianism had closer contact with Islam than Manichaeism did. But even in this case the situation was not the same in all Muslim countries. Although Zoroastrianism was known everywhere at the popular level, in the Arabic-speaking part of the Muslim world it was not studied as much as in Persia, its ancient homeland. In Persia, Zoroastrianism mainly provided a vocabulary for Sufi poets such as Hafiz, who frequently speak of the fire temple, the Zoroastrian priest, and so on, as symbols of the Sufi center, Kanika or Zawiya, the spiritual master, and so forth. However, this vocabulary in no way implies a historical influence of Zoroastrianism on Sufism. Rather, it is a means by which the Sufi asserts the independence of esotericism from the exoteric forms of revelation, in the sense that esotericism does not derive from exotericism, but directly from God, who is the source of revelation because he contains within himself both dimensions. Zoroastrian angelology and cosmology were further renewed by Shihab al-Din Shirawardi, founder of the Illuminationist school, Ishraq, who rendered these symbols transparent in the light of Islamic gnosis. The Ishraqi school itself exercised, in this field, an influence on certain late Zoroastrian schools, such as the movement associated with the name of Adhar Kaivan. It is when we turn our attention to the religions of India, essentially Hinduism and Buddhism, that understanding their religious forms and penetrating them becomes, from the Islamic point of view, more difficult. This difficulty is due not only to the mythical language of the Indian traditions, which differs from the abstract language of Islam, but also to the fact that, in moving from the Islamic tradition to the Indian traditions, one passes from the Abrahamic traditional sphere to a different spiritual climate. Nevertheless, Islam has maintained profound relations with the religions of India, both on the formal and the metaphysical level. From the earliest period, Islam had already received partial knowledge of Indian culture through Indian sciences, transmitted to Muslims through Pahlavi versions or directly from Sanskrit. But it was thanks to the incomparable Kitab al-Hind, or India, of al-Biruni, a work unique in the rigor of its method, that medieval Muslims came to know Hinduism, and in particular the Vaishnava schools, of which al-Biruni seems to have had the deepest understanding. He was also the translator into Arabic of the Patanjali Yoga, thereby inaugurating a tradition of relations with Hinduism which, although interrupted at various times, continued through Amir Khusraw of Delhi, then Abu al-Fazl and Dara Shikoh, culminating in the great movement of translations of Hindu works into Persian during the Mongol period. On the religious plane, although the Zoroastrians were eventually admitted among the people of the book, al-Kitab, there existed controversy among Muslims regarding the position that should be granted to Hinduism, even though, as already mentioned, many Indian ulama considered the Hindus without reservation as people of the book. It goes without saying that, in India, Muslims, unlike those living in Arabia, did not regard Hindus as pagans or idolaters, but rather respected their different religion. As already noted, many Sufis in India defined Hinduism as the religion of Adam, and an orthodox saint of the Naqshbandi order, Mirza Mazhar Jani Janan, considered the Vedas to be texts of divine inspiration. There existed, in fact, within Islam an intuition of the primordial character of Hinduism, which led many Muslim thinkers to identify Brahma with Abraham. This identification may appear strange from a linguistic point of view, but it contains a profound metaphysical meaning. Abraham is, for Islam, the primordial patriarch par excellence, identified with the primordial religion, al-Din al-Hanif, the same religion that Islam came to reaffirm. The relationship established by Muslims between the religion of the Barahima, that is, the Hindus, and that of Abraham therefore constitutes an explicit affirmation of the primordial character of the Hindu tradition. The Sufi master Abd al-Karim al-Jili writes, "The people of the book are divided into many groups. As for the Barahima, the Hindus, they claim to belong to the religion of Abraham and of his descendants, and they possess particular acts of worship. The Barahima worship God directly, without recourse to the mediation of prophets or messengers. Indeed, they hold that there is nothing in the world of existence that has not been created by God. They bear witness to His unity in being, but they completely reject prophets and messengers. They worship the truth in the same manner as the prophets before receiving their prophetic mission. They consider themselves the children of Abraham, peace be upon him, and claim to possess a book written for them by Abraham himself, peace be upon him, who, in turn, received it from his Lord. That book, which deals with the truth of things, is divided into 5 parts. 4 of them may be read by anyone. But the reading of the 5th is reserved only for a few among them, due to its depth and unfathomable meaning. Among them it is well known that whoever reads the 5th part of that book will necessarily enter the fold of Islam and embrace the religion of Muhammad, peace be upon him. Al-Jili distinguishes between Hindu metaphysics and the everyday practice of Hinduism, identifying the former with the Islamic doctrine of divine unity. His reference to the 5th Veda alludes precisely to the inner identity between the esoteric and metaphysical doctrines of both traditions. He sought, like other Sufis, to approach Hinduism through a metaphysical penetration of its mythic structure, in order to reveal the presence of the one behind the veil of multiplicity. In this respect, his approach did not differ essentially from the attitude of those Sufis who attempted to interpret the Christian Trinity as an affirmation, rather than a negation, of divine unity. The translation of Hindu works into Persian during the Mughal period constitutes an event of enormous spiritual importance, the true significance of which has not yet been fully appreciated, especially by those Muslims who are neither Persian nor Indian. The central figure of this movement was the Prince Darashikhu, to whom are owed the translations of the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of the Blessed, the Yoga Vasistha, Compendium of Yoga, and above all the Upanishads, arcane texts. It was from his Persian version that Enkidu Dupuran produced the Latin translation, which exercised a profound influence on numerous 19th-century European philosophers, including Schelling. The poet and mystic William Blake even possessed a copy of this translation. This version, fundamental for the development of Hindu studies in the West, has an even greater significance for the contemporary religious encounter between Hinduism and Islam. Just as the Crusades almost completely destroyed friendly relations between Islam and Christianity in the Near East, the events of the past century have hindered contact between Hinduism and Islam in the Indian subcontinent. Perhaps only a country such as Persia, where historical contact with Hinduism has existed and where no severe political confrontations have taken place in recent times, could constitute the most suitable place for the development of a fundamental and high-level study of the relations between Hinduism and Islam. In any case, the translations of Darashikhu are far from being indications of syncretism or eclecticism, as can be seen in certain other mixed movements in India. Dara was a Sufi of the Qadariya order and a devout Muslim. He believed that the Upanishads were the hidden book referred to in the Quran, 56:77-80, and he wrote of them that they contain the essence of unity and are secrets that must be kept hidden. The book, Meeting of the Two Seas, is an attempt to demonstrate the identity of Islamic and Hindu doctrines on unity. It is enough to read one of the Upanishads translated by Darashikhu to realize that he did not merely translate terms into Persian, but also sought to transpose the concepts into the framework of Sufism. His translations contain a Sufi interpretation of the Upanishads and, far from constituting an attempt at syncretism, represent a remarkable effort to build a bridge between Hindu and Islamic metaphysics. His translations, along with many others of Hindu classics such as the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and the Yoga Vasistha, on which the Persian scholar Mir Abu al-Qasim Findariski wrote a commentary, constitute a true treasure that should be more widely known in the Muslim world and not remain confined to the Persian and Indo-Pakistani sphere. These works, like those of other Sufi masters of Muslim India, such as Ghaus Ali Shah, writings on the dissemination of Tantrism, and many others, have often provided the most penetrating explanations of Hindu metaphysics and mythology, and can serve as a basis for a profound study of the Hindu tradition in light of the present situation. It is striking to note that, although Islam maintained numerous contacts with Buddhism, Muslim sources speak far less about this tradition than about Hinduism. Naturally, through the translation of the Panchatantra into Arabic from Pahlavi, as well as through other literary sources and oral traditions, some knowledge of the Buddha as a sage figure was transmitted, to the point that he was often identified with Hermes, the origin of wisdom. Many common sources from various sects and religious schools consider Buddhism a branch of Hinduism, and even al-Biruni, in his India, paid little attention to it. If we exclude more recent writings by Indian Muslims, the most serious and notable study of Buddhism in the Islamic annals is relatively late, from the 8th/14th century, and is found in the Universal History of Rashid al-Din Fadl. The chapter devoted to Buddhism, a religion that likely gained renewed interest with the arrival of the Mongols, is based mainly on a set of traditions and included the direct collaboration of a Kashmiri Lama, Kamalashri Bakshi. The chapter includes an account of Indian mythology drawn mainly from the Puranas and the best description, from a Muslim perspective, of the yugas, cycles, although always from a Buddhist rather than a Hindu standpoint. However, the most remarkable part of the work is the narrative of the life of the Buddha, which is the only such account in Islamic writings. The Buddha is regarded as a prophet, whose book, called the Abhidharma, contains the quintessence of truth. Evidently, Muslims see in all divine incarnations, avatars, other prophets in the Islamic sense, so the interpretation of the Buddha as a prophet is not surprising. The excellent account of the life of Shakyamuni, ascetic of the Sakya, epithet of the Buddha, became well known and was included in many later Persian works of universal history. However, there were no other major works on this subject, as there were for Hinduism, mainly because later there was a lack of direct contact with Buddhism, except in Western China, where Muslim communities continued to live relatively isolated from the main currents of Islamic intellectual life. This analysis of some key features of the historical relations between Islam and other religions has shown that, throughout Islamic history, Muslims have perceived the presence of other traditions at different levels and in different ways, which can essentially be reduced to the following: Sharia, theology, history, science, philosophy and scholarship, and finally Sufism or esotericism. At each of these levels, the encounter with other religions has had and continues to have its importance, and every contact can contribute to a fuller understanding of other traditions. At the level of the Sharia, Islam has always considered other religions as similar forms of divine law. Many medieval jurists referred to the shar, path, divinely ordained way, of other prophets and other peoples, and Islamic law itself recognizes other populations living within the Islamic world, Dar al-Islam, as having the freedom to follow their own divine law, to practice their own methods within their community, and to enjoy the fullest religious independence. Several studies have been carried out on so-called comparative religious legislation, in which the religious precepts of different communities are described and compared. Muslim jurists were also the first to develop an international jurisprudence and sought to establish appropriate means to regulate relations between peoples following different legal systems. This descriptive and morphological study of the sacred laws of other religions can today be continued on the basis established by classical jurists that in earlier times, debates were held between Muslims and followers of other religions, particularly encouraged by the Mutazilites. Discussions were also held with Shiite imams and often with the followers of those religions themselves, as attested in Shiite sources such as the works of Ibn Babawayh. Ismaili authors also continued to address other religions, especially due to their strong interest in prophetic cycles and the universality of esotericism. From these theological debates emerged numerous studies on sects, for example, al-Milo wa al-Nihal, to the point that it can be said that Muslims were the founders of the comparative science of religions. Many highly important theologians, both Shiite and Sunni, wrote works such as Book of the Disputations of the Sects by Sa'd ibn Abd Allah al-Ash'ari al-Kami, Book of the Sects of the Shiites by al-Nabakhti, Difference between the Sects by al-Baghdadi, The Disputations of the Muslims by Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, founder of Ash'arite theology, the chapter by Ibn Hazm, The Beliefs of the Sects of the Muslims by Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, and The Famous Religious Communities and Sects by al-Shahrastani. All these authors were eminent theologians who studied other religions mainly from a theological, generally polemical standpoint. Contemporary theological debates, especially between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, can benefit from these texts in order to properly frame relations between the different faiths. There is also the tradition of historians who attempted to describe in a simple and as objective a manner as possible what they had seen or read about other religions and religious cultures. This is the case of universal historians such as al-Masudi and al-Yaqubi. Al-Masudi also wrote a detailed treatise on religions entitled Chapters on the Foundations of Religious Conceptions. The Catalogue of Ibn al-Nadim and The Explanation of Religions, by Abu al-Mali Muhammad ibn Ubayd Allah are also magnificent works. References to other religions are likewise found in al-Biruni and in Nasir-i-Khusraw, in their commentaries on Abu al-Abbas al-Aranshari, who is said to have studied the doctrines of other religions with great interest. The incomparable al-Biruni, not only in his work on India but also in the chronology of ancient nations and in many other writings, has transmitted an enormous amount of information about numerous religions. This tradition continued in later universal histories until very recent times, in texts such as the Transcriber of Histories, compiled in Persia about 100 years ago. However, these later works are largely elaborations of earlier texts on specific religious topics. This tradition of objective study of other religions could once again serve as a basis for contemporary works in Islamic languages on Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, and even the religions of the indigenous peoples of America, as well as on Christianity and Judaism. Nevertheless, many non-Muslim authors have written in Islamic languages on these topics, though not specifically with the aim of fostering mutual understanding between religions. Descriptive accounts of this kind should be based on authentic sources and, especially with regard to Eastern traditions, should not repeat, as is in fact often the case, the errors and prejudices of Western texts translated into Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and other languages. In the fields of science, philosophy, and culture in general, the integration of scientific, philosophical, and cultural elements within the Islamic conception of the world would also imply contact with the religions of the civilizations from which such material originates. It must be remembered that, in a traditional civilization, every science is in some way linked to the religious principles of that civilization. Indian medicine and astronomy, which Muslims adopted very early, brought them into contact with certain Hindu cosmological conceptions. Indian and Persian texts on natural history familiarized Muslims with the religious conceptions of nature expressed in those works. As for the sciences of Greco-Hellenic origin, Muslims, although they did not show interest in the Olympian gods, came to know, through Greek philosophical and scientific texts, those Orphic Pythagorean elements of the Greek tradition that interested them greatly precisely because they constituted an affirmation of the doctrine of divine unity. Muslims referred to Plato as the Imam of the philosophers, and to Plotinus as the Sheikh of the Greeks, that is, their Sufi master, precisely because they found in their writings an expression of the same metaphysical doctrine that Islam would later present as its own. In the Ashraqi, illuminative, theosophy of Shirawardi, moreover, there are constant references to the universality of a wisdom to which all nations of antiquity are said to have had access and which found its highest expression precisely in Islamic gnosis. This is in fact the same wisdom that later Steuben, Leibniz, and neo-scholastic thinkers would call philosophia perennis, a definition which K. Kumaraswamy rightly completed with et universalis. In any case, it is at the level of esotericism, from the Sufi point of view, that the most significant encounter with other religions has taken place, and where today the indispensable basis for a profound understanding of other traditions must be sought. The Sufi is the only one who seeks to transcend the world of forms, moving from multiplicity to unity, from the particular to the universal. He abandons the multiple for the one and, precisely through this process, affirms his vision of the one in the many. For him, all forms, including religious ones, become transparent and reveal their belonging to a single origin. Sufism, or Islamic gnosis, is the most universal affirmation of that perennial wisdom which lies at the center of Islam and is, in reality, found in all religions as such. This supreme doctrine of unity, uniquely one, al-Tawhid Wahid, is called by Sufism the religion of love, and Ibn Arabi refers to it in his famous verses of the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, the interpreter of desires. This love does not signify only feeling or emotion, but the realized aspect of gnosis. It is transcendent knowledge that reveals the inner unity of religions. Yabastari alludes precisely to this truth when he writes, "The necessary being is like the sky, while hell is the contingent. I and you are the veil of Hades between them. When that veil is lifted before you, the limits of sects and beliefs fall away. All authority of the law rests upon this I of yours, since it is bound to your soul and your body. When I and you are no longer in between, what then do the mosque, the synagogue, and the fire temple mean?" Although not all Sufis have been specifically concerned with the question of other traditions, some of them have engaged in detailed discussions of the subject. Ibn Arabi, one of the Sufis regarded as revealing the doctrines of Sufism in their fullest form, explicitly affirms the theory of the universality of revelation. He writes, "Know that when God, the Most High, created beings, He created them of different kinds, and in each kind he placed the best, choosing from the best the most perfect blossom. These are the believers, mu'minin. And from among the believers he chose the most perfect blossom, who are the saints, and from this blossom the quintessence, these are the prophets, anbiya. And from this quintessence he chose the purest parts, and these are the prophets who bring a divine law. Ibn Arabi and, after him, al-Jili, also developed the theory of the logos, according to which the founder of every religion is an aspect of the universal logos, which they identify with the reality of Muhammad, al-Haqiqa al-Muhammadiyya. Ibn Arabi's masterpiece, Fusus al-Hikam, the bezels of wisdom, is indeed an exposition of the particular genius of each prophet as the word of God. The Sufis also consider that, just as every creature in the universe is a theophany, tajalli, of a divine name, likewise each religion reveals an aspect of the divine names and attributes. The multiplicity of religions is the direct result of the infinite richness of the divine being. Al-Jili writes, "There is nothing in existence except that it worships God, the Most High, through its state, its words, and its acts, and even in its essence and qualities. And all that exists obeys God, the Most High. But acts of worship differ due to the specific difference inherent in the divine names and attributes." The Sufis not only affirm the unity of revelation, but also see themselves as custodians of Islam and of all other traditions. Let us again quote al-Jili. "The Gnostics are the seekers of the truth upon which God has built the foundations of existence. The spheres of the worlds revolve around them. They are the center of God's attention in the world, even the center of his theophany in existence. God has established the foundations of religion, indeed the foundations of all religions, upon the ground of their gnosis." Sufis have lived throughout Islamic history with an awareness of the universality of wisdom, of which they are the bearers through their theories and methods of realization. Some have had the particular vocation of speaking explicitly on this subject, while others have remained silent. Jalal al-Din Rumi, who even had Christian and Jewish disciples, and whose Masnavi is filled with verses affirming the universality of tradition, writes in the Fihi ma Fihi, discourses, directly referring to different traditions. "One day I was speaking among the people, and among them was a group of non-Muslims. In the middle of my discourse they began to weep and were seized by ecstasy and rapture. Someone asked, 'What do they understand? What do they know?' Only one Muslim in 1,000 can understand this kind of discourse. What do they understand that moves them to tears?" The Master replied, "It is not necessary that they understand the deepest meaning of these words. The essence of the matter lies in the words themselves, and these they understand well. After all, whoever knows the unity of God knows that he is the creator and sustainer, that he governs all things, that all things return to him, and that it is he who punishes and forgives. Whoever hears these words that describe and remind one of God is seized by a universal emotion and an ecstatic passion, for from them the fragrance of the beloved and of the one sought is diffused. Although the paths are many, the goal is one. Do you not see how many roads lead to the Kaaba? For one, the road comes from Rum, Anatolia, Byzantium, for another from Syria, for others from Persia, for others from China, for others from India and Yemen across the sea. Thus, if you consider the roads, the variety is vast and divergence infinite, but if you consider the goal, all converge. The hearts of all turn together toward the Kaaba. The hearts share a single love, ardor, and great longing for the Kaaba, and in this there is no place for divergence. This love is neither faith nor unbelief, it is not confused with the different paths mentioned. When they arrive there, dispute, war, and disagreement about the routes, by which one says to another, "You are a hypocrite, you are an unbeliever," and the other responds in the same way, disappear. Once they have reached the Kaaba, they understand that that struggle concerned only the paths, and that their goal was one alone. In short, all human beings, in the deepest part of the heart, love God and seek Him, pray to God and place all their hope in God, recognizing no one as omnipotent and supreme disposer of their destiny except Him. Such a perception is neither unbelief nor faith. In its interior it has no name. Now, those who cling to the letter imagine that the sacred mosque is that Kaaba to which the people take refuge. For the lovers, however, and for the chosen of God, sacred mosque means union with God. Continuing his explanation of the meaning of this union that transcends the world of forms, he adds, If I were to explain it in detail, the saints who have attained God would lose the thread of discourse. How is it possible to speak of such mysteries and mystical states to mortal men? A man does not see a camel on the top of a minaret. How then could he see the tip of a hair in the mouth of that camel? Not everyone is capable of seeing the camel on the top of the minaret, and even less of perceiving the hair in its mouth. But those who have attained that vision have the duty to explain to others, as far as possible, what they have seen. Today, specialized study can contribute greatly to bringing to light unpublished texts, revealing numerous forgotten chapters in the history of Islam's contacts with other religions. However, it still remains the task of the Sufis to illuminate the metaphysical domain, through which certain forms can be studied and understood. This does not mean that only the perfect saint, Wasl, the one who has reached the goal, can speak of the inner unity of religions. Only he, it is true, can speak from realized and lived experience, but others, endowed with intellectual intuition, can anticipate intellectually the center in which all rays meet, the summit to which all paths lead. Only such a vision of the center can make possible a fruitful dialogue between religions, showing both their inner unity and their formal differences, which also contribute to the richness of the spiritual life of modern man, compensating for the poverty of the spiritually impoverished environment in which he lives. With regard to Islam, the indispensable key to opening the door to an authentic encounter with other religions has already been provided by Sufism. It is up to contemporary Muslims to use that key and apply its fundamental principles to the particular situation that today presents itself in the Islamic world. Only through mastery of a metaphysical doctrine that distinguishes truth from falsehood, grounded in traditional orthodoxy, can the numerous pitfalls scattered along the path of serious religious study be avoided. Only through such a doctrine can a solid basis be established for a profound encounter with other religions on both the theological and social levels. Whoever has contemplated the summit that reaches into the infinite knows with certainty that those who climb by other paths are, in any case, fellow travelers on the single path of life worth following. Their certainty comes not only from the vision of the summit, but also from the knowledge that those paths, chosen for man by God Himself, ultimately lead to the peak, whatever winding routes they may take along the way. With regard to Islam, this knowledge is already contained in the treasury of Islamic wisdom. It is up to the modern Muslim to seek that wisdom, make it his own, and apply it according to his true needs.